Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to welcome you to this 18th event towards a global culture safeguarding program here at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. The title of today's event is 20 Years Since the Dallas Charter, Part 2, the firsthand witness accounts from the front lines. This follows up from previous event we held a couple of weeks ago with victim assistance coordinators from across the country and Alaska, really focusing in on and upon the survivor's experience. And that's where I'd like to begin today. I'd like to first of all thank and honor all the survivors who are on this call. As a victim survivor myself of Jesuit clergy sexual abuse and adult sexual misconduct, I want to honor you. I want to thank you for who you are and how you have weathered the storm for us in the church, how you have really led the way for us in the church to witness to the atrocity of clergy sexual abuse. And so if I may, I'd like to invite our panelists and all of those who have kindly joined on to this Zoom to simply be in silence for a period of time to honor those who are on the Zoom, their families and friends who have walked with them, and most especially those who are not with us this day and who have died because of suffering this horrible abuse. We honor you and those who can't be here this day. In these two events in November, we have attempted to look back at what has happened since the Spotlight series in the Boston Globe. We want to thank most especially those who've joined us today and look forward to the events that will come in the spring when we will then shift our focus to what might the next 20 years look like. I'd like to give a special thank you today for our co-sponsors, certainly the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, the Collaborative for Global Children's Issues here at Georgetown, and the Initiative for Catholic Social Thought in Public Life. They are invaluable colleagues and friends who help us do our work together. We welcome your feedback today. As a matter of fact, if you see at the bottom of your screen the function for Q&A, we will have time towards the end of our event today to really answer your questions live. And so I want you to notice that. Feel free to place those comments and those questions and for us to pursue, and hopefully we can share with our panelists this day. We really have a stellar group of panelists today. I am so delighted and pleased. Honored to be with you all on this panel. In a very just amazing way, we've had people who've been at the forefront of really dealing with the sexual abuse crisis in many different ways and in many different levels. And so we have Jennifer Beste, who's joining us from Minnesota this day, who is the co-chair of Catholic Social Thought and Culture at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. She holds a master's degree in divinity from Vanderbilt's Divinity School and a PhD in religious ethics from Yale. Welcome, Jennifer. Welcome, Jason Barry, longtime hero of mine, Jason, as you know, having met. It was in 1992 when his landmark investigative book, Lead Us Not Into Temptation, was published. It was 1992 when I decided I would study this topic. Since then, he's written Render Unto Rome, The Secret Life of Money in the Catholic Church, 2011, and most recently I saw him receive just a stellar recipient of the Child USA Award, the Sean McMile Hero Award for reporting on clergy abuse crisis. So welcome, Jason. Nicole Winfield, also just a point person in this entire experience, reporter with, a journalist with the Associated Press based in Rome. So good evening, buonasera. Welcome, Nicole. 20 years you've reported on this reality for the Associated Press and seen 3 papacies come about and 2 pass. and you're currently living through the third. So you've lived through and reported during the papacy of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, and now Francis. And you're a graduate of Johns Hopkins University, my alma mater, also having been a postdoctoral fellow there. So welcome, especially thank you for coming from such a long distance over the airwaves. Finally, our stellar group of panels is filled out by Terry Kernan, President of Bishop Accountability, an archive and research organization devoted to documenting and understanding Catholic clergy abuse. Prior to founding Bishop Accountability in 2003, prior to founding this, Terry studied classics and art history at University of Wisconsin-Madison, go Badgers, and the University of Bristol in England, and worked in academic publishing and consulting. Welcome you, Terry. Welcome one and all. I'd like to really go quick round robin and start with you, Jennifer, if you don't mind. You know, what's the one or two things that you think are just really important from your years of experience, you know, and what's important for folks to know right now, right away?
There is a lot at stake in how Catholics respond to clergy sex abuse survivors. Already by the 1980s to 90s, trauma research was showing clearly that sexual abuse can severely debilitate a person's capacity to form a positive sense of self, exercise effective agency, and constructively relate to other persons and God. I have been pursuing questions, theological and ethical, about sexual abuse survivors' experiences for over 20 years now. And I recognized early on that the way survivors describe moments of healing and recovery offer important theological insight into the way in which God mediates grace. Trauma research demonstrates that supportive relationships are necessary to break through the totalizing effects of traumatization and the compulsive tendency to reenact trauma. We also know that supportive communal responses lessen the degree of trauma survivors experience, whereas unsupportive or apathetic responses increase their PTSD, anxiety and depression, addictions, and suicidality. These findings strongly suggest that a primary necessary way God needs to mediate grace is through supportive relationships and communities. While God's love is seeking to flow through creation and the church, one of the most effective ways that clergy sex abuse survivors heal and experience the divine is through other people. This insight powerfully transforms our understanding of why Jesus calls us to love our neighbor as ourselves, and it heightens our sense of our moral obligations to each other. It clarifies what is theologically and ethically at stake in our response to survivors. At stake is nothing less than the church's very purpose: to be the body of Christ and mediate God's healing, grace-filled presence to all. If we act in solidarity with survivors to pursue justice and use necessary resources to foster holistic healing, we allow God to work through us. Conversely, if we fail to be proactive and do not develop supportive relationships, we participate in moral evil because we block a primary way abuse survivors tangibly experience divine grace.
Gosh, thank you, Jennifer. So important for us to base this in the moral teachings of the church, the purpose of the church, and the communal nature of healing. That is the foundation, isn't it, of what it means to be a community. You know, that the relationships matter is what I'm hearing, and how those relationships are central to what has happened in regards to the failures of the past and a possible path forward. So thank you for that. Jason Berry, talk to us. What do you think important for folks to know right away with, you know, I know it's awfully difficult considering all that you've written, all that you've investigated, but it's, you know, as I mentioned before, you've been at this long before 30 years. So you were doing your investigations in the 80s, uncovered just the horror of what was going on in Louisiana. Now you've gone on to other work and really just breathtakingly groundbreaking work in regards to the new film that you've produced about New Orleans. And so I know your interests have expanded recently, but as you look back, what's important for people to know today, right away?
Well, first of all, Jerry, let me thank you for inviting me. I'm actually a graduate of Georgetown. I got a degree in English literature before the internet, although we did have electricity back then. And thank you indeed for the shout out for the film, City of a Million Dreams, which is a story of survival.
Oh, are you all experiencing a freeze with Jason? Yeah, Jason, we're experiencing a little bit of a freeze with you right now. I don't know if he can hear us. I think right now, Jason, we're going to have to interrupt and maybe go right to you, Nicole, as to what are the most important things you want our audience to hear today about your work and about what your experience sort of tells us as the most important things you see as central for people to focus in upon.
Well, I think I have an interesting perch here at the Vatican, in that I can kind of see the whole world from headquarters. And I think the number one takeaway that I would like to share is that while in the US, 2002 Dallas Charter was, this turning point, the rest of the world is still decades behind the US, and we are still seeing the beginnings of countries starting to deal with this problem. So by the time Dallas came around, this was an issue that was believed to really be exclusively an Anglophone problem. And it had come out in Australia, it had come out in Ireland, it was coming out in the US. And at least, the Vatican liked to think that it was exclusively an Anglophone problem. We now know that that's not the case. And so while this may feel like old news in the US, it is very, very, very present front page news in a lot of the world still. We have the French church, which is, really imploding right now with revelations. We have the German church, which, because of the extensive survey that was done back in 2018 and the revelations of the number of cases and the systemic structural problems that researchers blamed on the abuse crisis in Germany, we now have essentially the German church, going off on a really remarkable and controversial reform project where they are in dialogue with the laity to talk about these structural problems and how to fix them, to make sure that these kind of abuses of power, abuses of authority, don't happen again. So on the one hand, globalization of the realization of how bad this problem is and how universal it is. And then I'd also just like to say that thanks to the McCarrick case in the US back in 2018, the next frontier, I guess I'd like to say, is the abuse of adults and the abuses of power in the hierarchical structure of the church that makes even adults vulnerable. The McCarrick case was investigated because there was finally a complaint against the cardinal by a minor, but the investigation and the canonical trial turned out that he indeed had been abusing the adults in his care, the seminarians who were dependent on him. And so this idea that abuse of adults is a problem, is a very big problem, but is not yet a problem that the church is really dealing with in any systematic way, I think is kind of the next big thing that we're going to be looking at.
Thank you, Nicole. You give us that unique perspective, having lived in Rome, having seen what you've seen for 20 years now. it is a very important perspective because we here in the United States, and I think this is what you were hinting at, Jennifer, in the sense if we become complicit and complacent, we actually do harm. And I think what you're suggesting, Nicole, is the full reality of a global Catholic in the universal sense of church has to be really fully grasped, that various other communities are suffering and bleeding overtly. We are still suffering and bleeding, but so many in our community are saying we're done with it and we're over it and we've done enough, which again is morally outrageous to me, but I think it's important to note. The other key point I think is really critical is this whole area of adult misconduct, which certainly was highlighted in the Carrick affair, certainly seems to be very, very important in developing countries and in this country too, that we barely looked at, that what is the definition of vulnerable, and is a person in a pastoral relationship always in a vulnerable position with a priest? It's the question I'd like us to sort of raise and perhaps comment on in our question and answer. But thank you, Nicole. Beautiful opening 2 points. Terry, where would you like to start? How would you like to start our conversation from your perspective? You've done so much work of really being an archivist to a certain extent and really preserving the stories of survivors and how important that is in your ministry and in your work. And so from that perspective, or from what you're hearing from others on the panel, what is it that you would like to start out today as really most important that you want people to focus in on?
Thanks so much, Terry. And as Jason said, we're also grateful that you've brought us together today. I begin, I think, with the point, Nicole, that you made that expands really the brief of the charter. The charter is really focused on the abuse of children appropriately, but we know from the work of Richard Sipe and others that the reality of clergy misconduct is a lot larger than that, a lot bigger than that, and there are many, many more survivors than that. And I think in another way the charter is a convenient benchmark for us in this discussion, but I think it's important to remember that the time from the charter to now is but a kind of fragment of the arc. And the arc really begins perhaps at the Didache or at the Council of Elvira. Clergy abuse has been a problem in the church nearly forever. And the history represented by Jason and others goes back quite a number of years before the charter. And indeed, the charter is a moment in the self-realization of the church. I would perhaps turn our attention rather to the revelations that survivors have achieved that prompted that self-revelation.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to talk later about the complementarity of people, how we as a community have helped each other get where we are today and where we're going. And also the complementarity of sources, how sources have, each of the sources that helps us learn about this has its problems and has its strengths. And by putting them all together, we can achieve a picture that I think is fundamentally the achievement of the survivors who have prompted all of this thoughtfulness about a terrible problem. I'm thinking of the Link Up back in the 90s, of the amazing work of SNAP, the Survivors Network of those abused by priests, and more recently, Nicole, to your point again, the work of ECHA, which is really a community of communities that brings international organizations together to think about and act about this problem as a larger community of people who are concerned.
Terry, could you want to explain what ECHA is to our audience?
It's an organization that stands for Ending Clergy Abuse. It was the brainstorm really of Barbara Blaine, the late Barbara Blaine, who the founder of SNAP, who realized that SNAP was but one group of people working on this, and that there were people in Poland, in France, in Italy, in South America, in Spain. And ECHA is this wonderful organization that brings various organizations together to work on this.
Lovely. Terrific. Thank you, Terry. Jason, welcome back. It's delightful to see you. This is the vagaries of modern technology. Just to let you know, we've had some really beautiful initial responses. Jennifer really highlighting the sort of role of community, the moral imperative of really having relationships that heal, and how much it is the purpose of the church. Nicole talked about the global reality associated with this now, especially now in Germany and France with the new scandals, and also the new realities of misconduct and abuse of vulnerable adults, and adults being the next unattended to crisis. And I love that image that you just heard, Jason, too, and thank you, Terry. We've really been led into this by survivors, haven't we? By that courageous family in the 80s who didn't settle for the lawsuit, the Gastel. So in many ways, we would not be here without survivors. And I think we have to really start there and always go back to that reality that the church, I think, is in the hierarchical form, seems to consistently forget that we need to walk with and listen to and be attentive to the survivor reality. And I think that's my hope for the next semester, is what might a survivor's perspective do for the next 20 years of a response. So thank you, Terry, for that. And thank you for what you've done over these years. Jason, one or two things that you'd like to start us out on? You are muted, just to let you know. So if you want to unmute yourself and then just share.
I don't know why my connection dropped.
It's some hierarchical function. We won't get into.
Well, we will avoid the talk of that. I guess the two things that really strike me, and I would echo everything that has been said about the survivors. The work I did in the 80s, reporting on what became the 92 book, Lead Us Not into Temptation, was lined with long experiences listening to survivors. I felt at times almost like a counter confessor, hearing the stories that the church had not heard or would not hear. That said, I guess there are two things that strike me in a sort of touch tone sense. One is the charter itself. I think we have to remember why it was written in the early months of 2002, when the media firestorm was rolling across the country after the Boston Globe series began. Typically, there are maybe 35 or 40 reporters, religion editors and reporters, who would go back in those days to the twice yearly bishop conferences of the Bishops' Conference conventions. In Dallas in June of that year, there were 700 accredited journalists.
Wow.
And one of the little known facts about that harrowing period for the bishops is that they utilized a Madison Avenue damage control public relations firm called R.F. Binder and Associates. And R.F. Binder's job was to help them steer out of this terrible media coverage and somehow try to regain a position of prominence in the public square. The charter was written during that period, and that's to take nothing away from the moral sensibility that is embedded in those pages or the ideals that are expressed. But I think we have to remember that it came about as a damage control response, and at the same time, when the first National Review Board was formed to lead the church, so to speak, lead the bishops into a new awareness, which is something I suppose we could all talk about. The other thing that, to me, the core issue across 30 years of all this is structural mendacity, institutionalized lying. you know, you might expect it in a dictatorship. You might expect it in certain administrations, in democracies. Obviously, state secrets have a role in the life of any government. But when there is such a concerted effort to conceal horrendous behavior against children, I think we have to ask not just the legal questions, but the underlying moral question. What is wrong with this power structure? The problem is the power structure, and we see it today with so many of the grand jury reports and government investigations. Just the other day, the Washington Post had a piece about Archbishop Laurie of Baltimore and the fact that he approved paying funds to a second group that tried to prevent one of these government reports from coming out. Nowhere in the charter that I'm aware does it say that bishops have to engage in fearless moral searching and accountability, if I can borrow a line from St. Ignatius. And so that's sort of where I begin anytime I'm in a conversation like this. And I'm flattered to be among colleagues who have done such remarkable work.
Well, likewise too, Jason. I think we all owe a great debt of gratitude to you. And I think those 2 points really highlight, you know, one of the primary realities. I was just watching again the full report of the Australian report. And in that, again, it was the concern to cover the reputation of the institution, protect the institution. And then now we're seeing, I think perhaps, I'm talking to some folks in the field, that we're seeing a very different wave right now. With France, you know, leading the way, with Germany, with so many different countries really coming to the forefront of that next level that you were referring to, Nicole. And so I think if that structural malaise is not dealt with, as Jim Keenan at Boston College calls it, a hierarchialism, then I think what you're talking about then permeates still all that you've investigated now for over 30 years. And so there's great wisdom in that reality, because it's an amoral reality, isn't it? And it acts in an amoral way. And that's the mendacity issue, I think, that you're pointing to. Thank you for that wisdom. I do want to go back to each of you now, just with, you know, just if you could develop more fully what you initially said. So Jennifer, let's start back with you for, you know, you've done a lot of research in this past 20 years. You're still doing a lot of research. You really focused so much of your career on this. What else would you like to share with us today as to what's happened in these past 20 years? And what have you seen? What have you learned that, you know, you think would be helpful for us to hear?
Thank you, Jerry. You know, I'd like to just share from the outset that my perspective on the church's 20-year response to clergy abuse survivors is not only grounded in my theological and ethical research, trauma studies, but also from being in relationship with survivors over the past 20 years. I started as a young professor at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I taught in a weekend degree program where we had 23 to 66-year-olds enroll. And it struck me that every semester almost, I would have a person in my class, a student, reveal to me that they had been abused by a priest in Cincinnati. And having that happen every semester, and all of these survivors told me they would never tell their intimate partner. They never told anyone, and then they told me. So walking with them and walking with other survivors in Cincinnati, and then I moved to Minnesota, and I've been really amazed by the survivors in Minnesota. So my work and my passion is really grounded in listening to survivors and really striving for a reformed, just church. I had a really positive experience growing up as a Catholic, and I just I want all of our youth to have the kind of experience I did. I also want to mention just a thank you to an online support group that I've been a part of for the last year. Survivors from all over the United States have been in this support group since COVID, and I've just learned a lot from them. And, I think I have a sense of how survivors are experiencing the church now. So if I think about how much progress have we made in the last 20 years, my most honest answer is that the degree to which Catholics have supported survivors and allowed God to work through them to mediate grace has been uneven and varies depending on a survivor's diocese. Even a webinar on the USCCB website, Pastoral Care in the Current Crisis, acknowledges this. According to the charter, dioceses are to demonstrate a sincere commitment to victims' spiritual and emotional well-being and foster healing and reconciliation. However, the key problem that I'm finding is that bishops have not developed criteria or guidelines specifying what forms of support survivors all deserve. There's no minimal standard of support. Each bishop has authority over his diocese allocation of financial resources and ultimately chooses what kind of support survivors have access to. And so, even as the USCCB webinar said, this presents a serious obstacle to really responding justly to all survivors. The amount of care that you receive should not be dependent on what one bishop says. Also, we do not have accurate data on the kinds of support survivors are receiving. In the last 10 years, the only data that the charter auditors from Stonebridge have collected about outreach to survivors is the number of allegations reported, how many days it took for the archdiocese to make contact with the survivor, and then the number of survivors who received some sort of service. But there's no transparency about why is it that 1,100 people received service and the other 2,000 didn't. Another main obstacle to knowing how well the church is doing is that the charter auditors do not consult and survey survivors about their experiences of being supported or not supported by their bishop, diocese, and their parish community. In my view, as a Catholic moral theologian, to exclude survivors' voices and experiences in the audit is morally unconscionable. And, as I looked back at every single audit to prepare for this, I was struck by how the earliest audits do have survivors' perspectives, and they did interview survivors. So at the very beginning, when there was so much media attention in 2004 and 2005, they did consult survivors. So we need to ask, why did the auditors stop consulting survivors? So we obviously cannot know whether Catholics are being the body of Christ and mediating God's presence if bishops do not conduct extensive research studies on survivors' perspectives about their needs, support, and outreach. Such studies would enable us to identify areas of strengths and weaknesses and learn which forms of support foster healing and justice most effectively. My overall sense from listening to survivors in the last year to year and a half is that we as Catholics have a long way to go in demonstrating a sincere commitment to survivors' healing. Before Catholics can support healing and even broach the very idea of reconciliation with survivors, we first need to accompany them in their pursuit of justice. In an article I wrote 15 years ago, I was then analyzing the progress made from 2002 to 2007 in terms of our responses to survivors. I really appealed to Catholic bishops to stop spending financial resources to maintain the legal statutes of limitation. And I was doing this because statutes of limitation are not only unjust toward clergy abuse survivors, but they thwart justice for all sexual abuse survivors and their families in American society. Since it usually takes at least 2 decades before child sexual abuse victims are psychologically able to disclose the abuse, And I would also add from my interviews with adult survivors, it often takes them 20 years as well. Many survivors can't pursue justice through litigation because the time frame to report the abuse has expired. Thus, their perpetrators are never held accountable for their crimes, and they have been free to sexually abuse other victims. Consequently, statutes of limitation undermine effective child sex abuse prevention throughout our society. When we diminish the list of known perpetrators, these statutes undercut the effectiveness of the law because attempts at reforms assume that citizens know and can identify previously recognized perpetrators. Furthermore, statutes of limitation incentivize institutions in our entire society to cover up abuse. Institutions wishing to escape accountability simply delay responding to allegations, and they create delays in investigations, the process, until the statute of limitations has expired. So considering all of this, it's deeply troubling to me that Catholic leaders continued to spend over $10 million from 2011 to 2019 to fight against reforms on statutes of limitation. Spending the church's financial resources to do this directly conflicts with bishops' promises to be transparent about abuse and be accountable. It also ignores Christ's preferential option for the marginalized, abused, and the oppressed. So I think that this is a major roadblock that we need to acknowledge and Catholics need to confront their leaders on. Also, to demonstrate sincere commitment to survivors' healing, we as Catholics also need to develop trauma-informed parishes where clergy abuse survivors have access to sacraments and communal support, even if they cannot even enter a church and attend Mass because it is too re-traumatizing. And again, I would say I was writing about trauma-informed responses when I was a graduate student at Yale before 2002. We've had the resources of how to support survivors for more than 20 years. We have the knowledge. It's also clear to me from listening to survivors that Catholic bishops, priests, and lay Catholics have not yet recognized how much theological and spiritual insight survivors have to offer us. Some survivors are currently still being denied meetings with their bishop. Others have told me about how they've offered bishops ideas about how to foster survivors' healing, and their ideas have been ignored for years, year after year after year. While I've heard some positive stories of priests supporting survivors and learning from them about how not to re-traumatize other survivors, I continue to hear many say they do not feel supported by their fellow lay Catholics if they're in a parish. Lay Catholics often unintentionally still say things that are re-traumatizing, or they simply avoid survivors because they don't want to confront the deep harms caused by clergy abuse. So again, I think that the results are very mixed. And then if I could just say one last thing, I think the good news is that we do have the knowledge to foster healing and create trauma-informed parishes. And what we do need to do is prioritize the financial resources, support better data collection, demand accountability, real accountability, and demonstrate the collective will to make these commitments a reality.
Well, Jennifer, thank you so much. Just so impactful. And what I love about what you're saying is how it centers upon the survivor's reality and your journey and your real accompaniment with them. In many ways, much like what Francis says, being a synodal church, that's a listening reality and the ethical imperative, I think, for us going forward that you've sort of given us hope for. But as a researcher, the appeal to data, I think, is really critical. Isn't it interesting? We know all too much about the perpetrators and all of that, but we know so little about the effects of the spiritual harm and woundedness on survivors. I think that's what you were also pointing to, and how that can be corrected because we know how to do this now. and can easily be included. Thank you so much. It's very enriching, and I think challenging moral imperatives here for us to consider. Thank you. Jason, now that you're with us, now that you're back, what sort of insights do you have for us that you would like to really focus in upon with, I know it's terribly difficult to summarize 30 years of being at this, over 30 years of investigations and hard work, but what do you see as some of the major points that you would want people to focus in upon today, following up on your first comments?
Well, I have the great disadvantage of going after Jennifer, who was so eloquent in reviewing her work. And for so many years, I was interviewing survivors and reading depositions as well. And I cannot tell you how many times I'd go back to my hotel room at night, or I'd go out and go jogging around some available green space, and I just kept thinking, there, but for the grace of God, go I. So I think the importance of developing a language of, a language of alliance between the church as a whole, the people of God, if that is what we are called to be and whom we are called to be, and the survivors as part of that society is ever so important. I guess one of the things that keeps coming back to me is the continued failure of the bishops to abide by what is fundamentally a statement of ideals in the charter. And I am not trying to quibble semantics here. Obviously, there are some very well honed points, but there is nothing in the document that requires oversight of bishops. Even now, the Vatican is still experimenting with what boils down to fraternal correction, which was the solution, if you will, that the initial report by the 2002 through 2004 National Review Board came to, with some very strong language along the way, but ultimately they said it's the responsibility of the bishops to police themselves, which I never thought would work. And I don't think you have to be a prophet to have seen that. Article 3 says dioceses, eparchies will not enter into confidentiality agreements except for grave and substantial reasons brought forward by the victim survivor. Well, that is not a plank that is being honored in a number of places. Just to give you one example among many that are available in the media, one of the prominent survivors here in New Orleans was told that if he spoke about his settlement, he would be taxed by the IRS. It was an implicit threat. Well, he eventually had a crock with it and went to a television reporter and told his story. I don't think he's been approached by the IRS. And of course, the point here for people who may not be aware is that settlements typically for abuse or any kind of injury are not taxed because you didn't invite the injury. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, when the bishops work so hard to keep information out of the realm of the Catholic public square, then we have to ask ourselves, what do they expect will happen when a grand jury or an attorney general goes in and we discover there are like 180 perpetrators instead of 40 or 50 or 60? This is a pattern all across the country. When law enforcement gets involved, we get the true numbers. And the self-reporting mechanism by which these former FBI agents went around to different dioceses, and they simply took the numbers that were given to them. Again, to Jennifer's point, they did not consult the plaintiff attorneys, SNAP, or the other groups of victim survivors. So I think there has to be some kind of meeting of the minds if we're really going to try to do something in a genuine reform posture, to acknowledge that we need the facts, we have to understand the truth, and we can only build on a foundation of truthful information rather than constantly reacting to stories that the press will continue to cover if law enforcement comes in and finds that the information given several years ago, in fact, grossly understated the number of perpetrators, to cite but one example. So I think of putting a strong premium on veracity, on being honest, about not telling lies. This may sound, sort of, like a primary text, but if you believe in the concept of redoux, radical, first things, I think the first things we have to get to are an absolutely truthful approach to the crisis that we are in now. It's now more than a generation that this aching reality is with us. An entire generation of Catholic children has grown up. So that would be my point.
Gosh, thank you, Jason. And it comes back to, I think, your hard work initially to expose the truth, isn't it? That, so much of what came out initially in all of those cases you investigated was just exactly those dynamics of how certain individuals were tried, had been attempted to be bought off, to settle. And it was the courage of that one family that said that we're not going to be part of this suit. And
well, let me just respond briefly then. I don't want to take up other people's time.
No.
The Gastels were indeed quite courageous in what they did as the first family to agree to be publicly identified. But, there's another dimension to this, and I would cite what happened in Cleveland in 1987. I had an assignment for the Plain Dealer. I did a long story about a priest. The diocese threatened to sue the newspaper if we identified the priest. And so the paper called upon the diocese, Bishop Pilla, to identify the priest. He, of course, would not. The newsroom was soon flooded with phone calls by survivors of other priests. Well, in 2002, this was 15 years later, when the world changed because of the Boston Globe, the chain reaction to the Boston Globe coverage, the Plain Dealer identified the priest. His name was Gary Berthiaume. By then, he had gone back to Michigan, where he had been sheltered, really, by Bishop Joseph Imish. Just recently, Berthiaume is now 80. He was convicted and sent to prison in Michigan because of statutory changes. Now, if you think about the boldness of the Diocese of Cleveland back in 1987, challenging a newspaper, threatening to sue on the basis that he had paid his debt to society, having served 6 months in a Michigan jail. And then 9 years later, unbeknownst to parishioners in Cleveland, was now a parish priest. If you think of that boldness and contrast it with the trail of damage that this man left, and now here he is 80 years old and he's serving a prison term, it's an example of how these cover-ups do so much damage and how the mentality of concealment and deception really cannot be sustained. My own view is that the Vatican needs an independent criminal court apart from canon law to oversee cases involving bishops, involving negligence or abuse. And that would free the Pope not to have to constantly intervene, but to be given forensic facts on which he could then make a decision.
And I think what it highlights is the lack of transparency and also the lack of how Vos Estis has been effective. It's not even been renewed, and the very thing of fraternal correction is just a pipe dream.
Yeah, it is.
Seeing that now being played out in all of the news stories that are just shocking to anyone's sensibility. But thank you for that example. That's so powerful and so concrete about this is the effect of what the lack of transparency does. People get hurt, people get harmed, crimes are committed. And it dates back, to various other high-profile cases. So thank you for reminding us of that. Thank you, Jason. Nicole, you had a very unique perspective, that global perspective, and then also the new sort of realities that are emerging. What do you see as important for us to focus in on from your experience, from what you've seen and heard over these 20 years?
I'd like to pick up from the point that Jason was just making, because it does kind of dovetail into things that I see here and now. I mean, we don't have to go back to the 80s, but the idea that the secrecy is so toxic and is so, it creates a double harm. And there are two cases that come to mind that are very recent. So everyone's happy. We have Vos Estis, we now have a mechanism to investigate bishops. They have always gotten off the hook for all these years. So finally, in 2019, Pope Francis passes this law, and now there's a mechanism. And we know that a good number of the Polish episcopate has been sanctioned under these measures, a handful of American bishops all around the world, but there's absolutely no transparency about who's under investigation and what the outcomes are. And so when, on the rare occasions, things do trickle out, it seems almost worse than the original crime of abuse, because it feels like the wool was pulled over your eyes, because you trusted that there was now a mechanism, but then somehow you don't have the information. And I'm thinking in particular of Bishop Bello. He is the Nobel Peace Prize winner from East Timor. He is a hero to an entire nation of people for having helped East Timor reach independence. It turns out last year, presumably under the Vos Estis methodology, he was sanctioned because he was credibly accused of abuse. No one knew until a wonderful reporter from a Dutch investigative magazine managed to get some of his unfortunate victims to speak. And so all of a sudden, it feels like there has been a secret that has been kept from the entire world. We had this great new law that was going to hold bishops accountable, but if you don't see justice working, how can you really trust that it is? And so the secrecy with which Bello was sanctioned, and that it only came out because of the courage of the survivors, who, at great personal risk, because East Timor is not a country where these things are talked about, and the fact that we haven't seen the floodgates open is an indication that they are probably undergoing some, retaliation. That shows that there's a problem with even this new step toward accountability, that if you don't see it working, you can't really trust that it is. Same thing happened in France just a few months ago. Bishop Sentier, this is a bishop who was allowed to resign. He was allowed to retire because he hit 75. And no one knew until, newspaper reports that he had actually been sentenced to penance and prayer for having done some very problematic things during confession. And the French Catholic public is outraged. How dare you withhold this information from us? And it feels like it's like a double abuse, that this person did horrible things to the victims, but now the French public, which would like to trust that the mechanisms are working, these sanctions are being meted out when they are meted out on the sly, and there's no transparency about who has been sanctioned. So the question is, if you can't see the justice working, how can you trust it? And I think that is dovetails with the whole question of secrecy, that secrets are toxic. And I think Pope Francis has, I don't know that he really gets it. He released, he abrogated the pontifical secret back in 2019, so that in theory, archives can be turned over when subpoenaed or to help with other cases. Victims are allowed to be told the outcomes of their canonical investigations. But secrecy still reigns in this whole process, which then comes to the other question of, a canonical investigation, and another point that Jason made of bishops and investigating bishops. There is just such an inherent conflict of interest in this whole canonical penal system, where in no other legal system would you trust that justice could be had when the superior or the bishop, who has a vested interest in keeping his priests employed because he has mass schedules to fill, he's invested money to have this guy sent off to the North American College in Rome to train him, he considers him a spiritual son. How on earth could we expect that this bishop or religious superior could be in any way an impartial judge to investigate these cases? It's not fair. I mean, it's not fair to even ask that superior because he cannot be impartial. It's an inherent structural conflict of interest. And it makes you question how can you trust the whole system? You asked me to, you spoke about the three papacies, and I would just like to, if I can, in broad, going papacy by papacy, I mean, there has been a progress, there has been change, and I think most people would consider that it has been for the better. Even before Dallas in 2001, that was when Ratzinger decided that he was going to, he saw what was going on from his perch at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and he had, he passed the first bit of legislation, internal church legislation, to make sure that his office received all these credible reports. So that predates Dallas and shows that Ratzinger kind of was hip to the problem and realized that what was going on was not in anyone's interest. That was all under pontifical secret. You can pick it apart and quibble with it. But with his, trusty sidekick, Monsignor Scicluna by his side, who Jason knows well from his days with the Legion investigation, they did what they could within the system to at least not let the problem grow. They kicked out, if I recall, from 2004 to 2014, they defrocked 848 priests. That was a number that was not made public at the time, but only after the fact. And one can quibble with whether defrocking is actually an appropriate punishment, because that releases the priest from any oversight and control and turns him out onto the streets, which may be a greater danger for society. But as far as the, diocesan insurance companies were concerned, that was the most important thing to do. Then there were a series of other measures passed during the Benedict papacy, and then Francis comes in, and he's Argentine. the scandal hasn't hit in Argentina or much of South America by 2013 when he's elected, and it's clear that he had a bit of a learning curve to get, and it came to the fore in 2018 when he really bungled the case in Chile involving a Southern bishop who had been accused of covering up for Caradima, the most egregious abuser in Chile. The Pope stood by the bishop, discredited the victims, and it all kind of blew up when he went to Chile in early 2018. And to his credit, he did the about face that he needed to do, which was to accept that he had really made a terrible mistake, error of judgment beyond, of papal proportions. He apologized repeatedly, and he set about on a course to try to not only make amends for his own error, but to bring the rest of the church along with him in this learning curve. And so we had a summit of the bishops' presidents in early 2019, coinciding with the McCarrick scandal, where Francis, he defrocked a cardinal. He put him on trial and he defrocked him. And then passed this Vos Estis legislation to try to address the questions of accountability in the hierarchy. But as I said earlier, it is flawed. And maybe this is just the inevitable first kinks in a new law and a new set of regulations that have to be worked out. And there are going to be problems, and until those problems become egregious and pressure is applied to make the Holy See address the problems, it will peter along. But I think the lack of transparency on the sentences is increasingly coming back to bite the Holy See, and they'll have to address it somehow.
And I think what you're suggesting there is so important, that you come full circle in one way to how, you're as sick as your secrets, as we said in AA, that the secrets, even in the new, Vos Estis, is problematic. And what I want to go back to is where you started. It almost causes a double hurt, doesn't it? That sense of that, you've been betrayed, and then, the very system that's supposed to, correct it and address the hurt hurts again. And so to me, that's a very profound insight in regards to, the vision you've had, the unique perspective of seeing so many different papal sort of responses, and we're in the middle of another wave, I think. And the opportunity to right the ship yet again, I think is there. But I think all the questions are pointing to, what about the organizational structural dynamics that need attention, that have not really been touched in any of the charter reforms and any of the recommendations that we've seen internally, though externally, all the studies are pointing to structural changes. And so with that, I'd like to segue into our last panelist, Terry. Thank you for your patience. And you've been at the forefront of this and really being with survivors, preserving survivor stories. And so I'm a great fan, as you know, of your work and of what you've done. And so what sort of wisdom can you share with us today?
Thanks so much, Terry, and Jennifer and Jason and Nicole. Awesome presentations. Maybe it's right that after a scholar, an author, and a journalist, you hear from the librarian last, the person who kind of collects the stuff. I'm going to talk about three things. First of all, briefly, my experience in this. Secondly, what the sources tell us about, the complementary sources tell us about people perhaps we've neglected during these 20 years, although we've learned a lot about their situation. What more can we learn? And then thirdly, the complementarity of people involved in this, particularly from the point of view of education, which we're all interested in, of course. So, you know, I got involved in this because I got to know a survivor, Greg Ford, and his family, Paula and Rodney, back in 2002. And it was really that friendship that convinced me that these 20 years and counting, I'd be spending on this. But it's really not my experience, it's really our experience. So there's Ann Barrett Doyle, who's our expert on Vocestis, the conundrum that Nicole, that you were discussing, and much else in the international scene. Susie Nauman, who maintains our database of accused priests. Steve Sheehan, who does special projects and also sends an email every day about the news of the day. And then there are the people who have been working on VA over the years. Paul Beyer, who started it with us. Kathy Shaw, who did Abuse Tracker for many years. Trish McClelland, who was the first person to really put the database together and maintain it. And Pauline Hodgson. And, you know, I think the common theme in all our experience is, again, how you survivors have taught us a lot that we really didn't want to know and were really resistant to knowing and really terribly ignorant of. And that initially was an experience that we had with the Boston survivors, people who came to speak at Voice of the Faithful meetings, incredibly courageous to stand up in front of 1,000 people and say these things that no one wants to speak and no one wants to hear. Extraordinary experience for us, a life-changing experience for us. And in a way, what we have done is to try to convey that life-changing experience to other people, to honor your witness to us by extending it to others. And we felt ourselves to be so fortunate over the years to be able to go every year to the SNAP conference in the summer and meet with hundreds and hundreds of survivors who generously spend their time and continue this education process that is so crucial to us and has been so, oddly enough, given how ugly the subject is, how beautiful it's been for us. And the beauty, oddly enough, because we're librarians, inheres in these absolutely remarkable documents that, Jason, you've been so familiar with for so many more years than I have. The reports that came out in a burst in 2003 and have continued to come out, we're now waiting with bated breath for Laurie to stop clutching the Baltimore report to his chest so that we can actually read that as well. That's Archbishop Laurie, who previously performed the same anti-transparency service in the Diocese of Bridgeport. Let's not put too fine a point on it. News coverage, Jason, to read your initial reports in the Times of Acadiana, all the way up to, you've been doing this so long, to the recent stories, Nicole, all of your work, all of your colleagues' work. When we don't have documents, when we don't have reports, we often have your journalism from the front. And we've collected that. And also, of course, the oral histories and the witness of survivors. And all of that mysteriously has come together in this database that Susie Nauman now maintains, which is a deep dive, person by person, into all of these accused persons. Over 7,500 of them now, and we're adding new ones every day. And this process, Nicole, as you said, is only beginning in other countries besides the United States and Australia and Ireland and now France and so forth. It's an amazing fact, although I grant the imperfections of their lists, that most of the bishops have now put out lists in the United States, and a lot of the religious orders have put out lists. They're not great. Some of them are terrible, but that the church is participating, at least in an imperfect way, in this transparency revolution is a really significant thing.
Mm.
Number two, what have we learned from these sources? I'd like to focus on a couple of things. We do know a lot about some dioceses. We know next to nothing about some dioceses. And religious orders really lag behind. And I think that this in part is because media coverage is easier to do for the dioceses which coincide with media markets. That's what happened in Boston, in Los Angeles, in Chicago, and many other places. Religious orders are harder to write about, and to some extent that is absolutely fine with them. They are absolutely dedicated to preserving their brand. Oh, sorry, I mean their charism. And not to be rude about this, but they are intent on that. Georgetown is, Fordham is, and they're pretty good at it. And I think what we'll see, perhaps in the next 20 years, is a wave of revelations that really help us understand the less understood reality of abuse in religious orders. We know something about abuse in Black Catholic communities, among Native populations, particularly in the West. The experience of devout survivors is something that is somewhat neglected in my view. Survivors who aren't public, there's so much to know about their experience. In Germany, we're learning a lot more, and here as well, about the abuse of religious sisters, about the abuse of women, about adult survivors. And I'd like to mention Doris Reisinger, who's done remarkable work in all of those areas.
Mm-hmm.
So we do know something about this, but I think we're going to learn a lot more, and I hope we will learn a lot more about these communities and these people in the years ahead. And then thirdly, we do here on this panel, we complement each other in our work. We're always depending on each other. And that came home to me really vividly this last couple of months. Jennifer, you and I have been doing work together in this Notre Dame project that Bishop Accountability did with the Kushwa Center. And one of our fellow participants in that is a woman named Marie Griffith, who teaches at Washington University. And she's teaching a course already on the abuse crisis there and has 20 or so absolutely amazing students who are reading books about this. There are survivors who are coming as guests to this course. A tremendous experiment, and one that I know will be repeated and built on. And we're going to get a whole new wave in the next 20 years, I hope, of the educational efforts that really we've just begun in the last 20. Thanks.
Gosh, Terry, thank you. Just so admire your work and so impressed with how you two are really lifting up the voices of survivors, the realities and experiences of survivors. And yet, pointing out, the deficiencies. We still don't know so much about the marginalized communities, and that, the devout survivor, the survivor who doesn't even come forward, and the staggering numbers of 7,500 offenders. I mean, that's just staggering. And if we go back to the John Jay studies, I think it was 2,400, if I'm not mistaken. So that the numbers have replicated and replicated to the point now that we're talking about tens of thousands of survivors here in the United States, of those who've come forward. And I think we need to sort of put that caveat before us. But what I really love is calling out the religious life and religious orders. And you're absolutely right that we, because of our trans state, sort of realities, we're not in one particular locale. And so we often are not the easy target of publicity and ought to be more transparent, as Jason has encouraged us to be. And I think as time will tell, that lack of transparency, that secrecy, as you pointed out, Nicole, will have its effects. And again, I think it's just come back to the courage of survivors to be who they are, and how much the next 20 years has to really be a survivors-led approach. And I think that's what you're reiterating, is when we listen to them and we accompany them, we're better for it, and we're more rooted in our purpose, as Jennifer started from the very beginning. In many ways, some of the questions have already been, we've had several just wonderful questions. Perhaps we can do a quick round robin on that. We're running out of time. So I do want to sort of come back to and honor the questions that we've had. There's several on Vos Estis, in the sense of, you know, why aren't we really addressing the dilemma with Vos? I think, Jason, you were mentioning the fact that we really need something independent of the bishops to investigate bishops. I think, Nicole, you were saying the same thing. It just, there's so many inherent conflicts of interest here. So those seem to be some of the answers that some of you are raising. Any one of you want to sort of comment on Vos Estis and give some sort of insight for our questions that you might have that has not been discussed yet? You know, Jennifer, did you want to start that, or Terry, did you want to start?
You know, I'd be happy to say very briefly, such a powerful part of your presentation, Nicole, and certainly a real problem. If I could toot the horn of my colleague Ann Doyle, she wrote a terrific piece in NCR about this very problem. And I would perhaps isolate three issues: the transparency issue, Nicole, that you mentioned, the way that Vos Estis has been built around the Metropolitan. Oh, am I muted? No, I'm good. Around the Metropolitan, so that you have these absurd situations where Cardinal Dolan is supposedly investigating one of his so-called suffragan bishops, and also the lack of lay involvement in the Vos Estis process, which I assume would conduce to more transparency once decisions have been made. So we actually know who has been disciplined and for what. So there are very clear changes that could be made in the system. Whether they will be made or not, I don't know. You know, Bishop Soto out in Sacramento back a couple of years ago suggested that the Vos Estis system should be audited. And we should actually take a look at how it's doing. And I think that was rejected absolutely out of hand by the bishops, including by Bishop Deely, who was chairing the session at the time. He said, "Well, we can't do that. We'd be auditing the Vatican if we did." Oh, horrors!
What a novel idea to hold our church leaders accountable. Nicole, did you want to comment, or Jennifer, did you want to comment on that? Okay, Nicole, did you want to add something?
I think, yeah, I think we're all kind of saying the same thing. Proposals for lay leadership, I seem to recall, I think Vos Estis allows for it, but doesn't require it. And I recall when Vos Estis was being hashed out, you know, there was, you know, the USCCB wanted to go their own way and have, you know, a fully lay-led oversight body to do these investigations, and that was just not acceptable to the Holy See. So I just kind of my spidey sense, knowing how the place operates, is that this will remain in the hands of the hierarchy. Within the system, though, I mean, again, this is the canonical system. So, you know, should these crimes even, you know, these are crimes. These are things that you know, there are police and law enforcement who are experts in this. And even then, these are some of the hardest crimes to prosecute, and even in the best of circumstances. So, I guess I've come to the idea that the canonical system is just it's almost a different species of what we're talking about, because these are not experts who are investigating crimes. These are bishops who, according to this particular legal code, want to mete out sanctions that, again, even the stiffest punishment is questionable as to whether it's actually a societal good. So defrocking is not necessarily a societal good. In fact, could be argued that it's a really bad thing to turn these abusers out on the streets. So yeah, within this prism of a very flawed set of procedures, transparency seems to be at least the least they can do. But that's
Yeah,
just me.
and not keeping secrets and keeping people informed of processes are really important. And that seems to be also, as you said it in your point, it tends to hurt as opposed to heal. And I think, can we have things going forward that are about healing the harm that's been done? There's one question I really want to do a quick round robin on, is that how could leaders who are preaching every day about morality and theologically rooted do such horrible, immoral, amoral realities on a consistent basis? And so any quick, pithy sort of ways, because I'm struck by and have seen depositions where I'm just stunned by the fact that bishops time and time again, and major superiors time and time again, never went to authorities, never went to the families, never sought out victims. It seems as though the very pastoral reality that they were trained in was abandoned, and the theological moral reality was abandoned. How do we explain that? How do we understand that? Jason?
I think the answer is, frankly, very simple. And I don't mean to reduce this whole crisis to the question of celibacy, but the bishops are unlettered in effective bonding. They don't know what it's like to walk the rug at 3 a.m. holding that baby with colic. They have not gone through the experience of sitting with kids who come home from school and are complaining because they can't get algebra right, or the big guy at the desk next door is being a bully. The experiences of parenting are so fundamental to understanding how you deal with children, with families, and they have no real experience in that other than what they learn, from childhood.
Jason, I'm going to challenge on that, because Des Cahill in the Australian Royal Commission said he saw that in every faith community with every faith leader, regardless of marital status or not. And so there's something about this that and again, I think you're absolutely right that when you don't have women who are at the table who've born children making HR decisions, when you don't have folks who've parented, that pays a price. But how is that? We see this across faith traditions.
Okay, so the Australian study you reference, I'm sorry, I haven't read it.
Yeah, the Royal Commission. Yeah.
Okay, so and they were dealing with Protestant denominations that had.
Yeah, they were dealing with every denomination in Australia. So to me, I guess, Jennifer, I'm going to go to you as the theologian here. How do moral leaders act immorally so consistently?
I really think I've been asking myself that question, and thanks to Terry, who's given me access to priest perpetrator files, I'm trying to understand the undergirding assumptions, theological assumptions that are allowing church officials to make such horrific decisions. And I really think, well, one of the key and obvious answers is just the inbred clericalism of both the clergy and the laity. So in terms of what I'm studying, I am, and this makes me concerned when we think lay leadership could be our solution. I get concerned about that because I see evidence in these priest perpetrator files of lay Catholics putting the perpetrator's interests and being their staunchest defenders
Yeah.
over the well-being of victims and the protection of children.
Yeah.
I mean, there are fathers writing letters saying, please give me this priest back in my parish, and he has 6 children. And he's saying, no, this man will be fine. He will not reoffend. So I think we need non-Catholics and really amazing experts to be part of those boards.
Thank you.
So but I really feel, and there's just such a deep, that clergy are above the law. I mean, how else would you explain the fact that we pay so much money to not repeal statutes of limitation?
Yeah.
They're above the law, and it's a normalized thing. So I really think clericalism is deeply to blame, the deep bonding you have with your son, the priest.
Yeah. Thank you. We are nearing the end. I wish we could go to the more questions, but I think we've answered the main ones. Again, we certainly will be available for other questions if people have them. I really want to do a very quick round robin as we end our time today. Really, if there's one thing, one takeaway or 2 takeaways you would want our audience to hear, what would that be? Jennifer, we're going to start with you where we started earlier.
You know, I was just reading Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail with my first-year students in intro theology class. And, you know, I was impressed by how many of them on their boards were struck by how he calls out white Christians for remaining, and they put this up to really feature this, quote, remaining silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows. And I just love that phrase, that, you know, how and it just occurred to me as they were talking about this, how relevant this is to Catholics today. You know, for non-abused Catholics, I think there is such a strong temptation for us to remain anesthetized. Perhaps we've become really upset about it and then we withdraw. It's very scary to enter empathetically into the lived reality of survivors. And it's also hard to confront the degree of moral evil present in bishops' cover up of this abuse. So, you know, I guess I would just say, I think Christian discipleship requires both of these things, our willingness. And then I just also want to mention that when we do accompany survivors, I think the first thing anyone will learn is that the mediation of grace flows in both directions. And so, I mean, just in my 20 years, like being confronted with survivors in the past in the files, what they did, what survivors are doing today. I mean, I'm speechless by how much they're willing to go, almost to the point, you know, they're going to like suicidality to try to protect future people from their abusers. And I mean, I know one survivor in my state right now who was warned that her life might be in danger because she's spoken up about a priest. So this is today. And so what they're willing to do to try to help us and help the church, it just has altered my vision of who Christ is and what it means to follow Christ. And it just, I don't know, it just has altered my being.
Thank you. Powerful words, powerful words. Jason, one quick takeaway. We're already just about over time, so.
I don't know if I have anything more to say. I think there has to be a standard of truth that we have to abide by.
Thank you, Jason. Nicole.
I'd like to end on a happy note, but unfortunately I have to say that I think it will still get worse before it gets better. We haven't even talked about Africa or Asia, and we have to assume that those will be the next ones to blow as Latin America continues its slow and steady simmer. So I think there's going to be a lot more pain and trauma that we will soon learn about in other parts of the world.
Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, it's a stark warning, but an important warning. Thank you for that. Terry.
You know, I would go back to Jason, you mentioned feeling like a counter-confessor when you were talking with survivors back in the old days and still. And Nicole, you mentioned Bishop Santier in France, whose offense was to force young men to do strip confessions. That was his mode of abuse. I work on confession, and it always reminds me about the Catholicity of the abuse. It's something I think we need to remember, but I don't think that the problem is simply the structure. It's deeper, deeper, deeper than that within Catholicism. And I think, unfortunately, we need to remember that this power is sometimes a harmful power. I'd end by saying a little bit more optimistically that we do see, I think, an arc towards justice in the United States. And I hope that those other countries, Nicole, that you mentioned, will follow the same arc eventually. And we have a ways to go ourselves.
Gosh, thank you all. What a rich discussion. What a powerful discussion. I think it gives us, hope in the sense of really urging ourselves and our community forward. A shout out yet again to the survivors. You continue to honor us by your experience and your courage. And we hope that these events really give voice to your reality a bit more each and every time we have them. I want to thank our co-sponsors yet again for the initiative in Catholic social thought and public life, and for the global collaborative on children's issues. And of course, here at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Please join us in the spring for our next follow-up as to what the next 20 years will look like. But again, I want to thank our panelists for their time, generosity, and wisdom this day. So Jennifer, to Jason, to Nicole, and to Terry, thank you. You honor us. And may we always have the survivor's voice, perspective in all that we say and do going forward. Thank you all.